Hey guys, tonight we begin with the grim, unsentimental truth of what happens when the world takes everything from you and leaves behind only hunger and a pair of hands willing to do anything to survive. You're not in a gleaming hall of conspirators, signing oaths with scented ink. You're crouched behind a collapsed fence, your ribs pressing against skin, your throat dry as old bone, your thoughts circling the same question. How far will you go to eat? A donkey brays in the distance, sounding almost offended by your existence. You pull your patched cloak tighter around your shoulders, though it does little to warm the spaces where muscle has withered away. It's easy, later, to pretend you made a choice, that you weighed options, counted costs, and stepped deliberately onto this path. But the truth, raw and ridiculous, is that you stumbled into it the same way you stumbled into everything. Exhausted, half blind with hunger, and too young to know better. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge across fields that used to feed your family. Used to. Until the Baron's men came to collect the debts no one remembered accruing. Your father had tried to reason with them. He even offered up the last pig and the cart and the half-built loom. But reason doesn't satisfy men who wear steel on their chests. The cart burned anyway. Your father didn't come back. Your mother tried to hold on. She scrubbed floors in other people's houses until her hands bled raw. But no amount of lie or whispered apologies would keep the ledger from growing. Eventually, she slipped away, as if she'd been planning an escape all along. One dawn, you woke up to find her pallet empty and the debt still waiting, clinging to your name like a curse. By the time you understood you were alone, you'd already begun to fade into a boy-shaped emptiness. You learned that hunger isn't a sensation, it's a language. It hums beneath your skin, turns your thoughts sour, teaches you that morality is for people with full bellies. Historians still argue whether the so-called crisis of the late Middle Ages really left so many peasants destitute that crime became the only alternative to starvation. You could answer that. You lived it. The first time you stole a loaf, it was almost a joke. The baker was a friend, used to slip you crusts when your father was alive. But that morning, he didn't look at you when you approached, just turned away, face stiff, and started kneading as though you'd never mattered. You took the bread anyway. You were so hungry you didn't even care when he shouted. You learned something important then. Desperation is invisible until it becomes inconvenient. That lesson followed you, sat beside you when you slept in abandoned sheds, when you dug half-frozen roots out of the ground, when you traded a copper ring, your mother's last gift, for a wedge of stale cheese. A week later, the opportunity came. A man with a scar across his lip leaned down to where you were crouched by the tavern wall, pretending to sleep. He asked if you could do something quiet for him. You didn't ask what. You didn't care. You heard only the promise of silver. You followed him behind the stable, where he pressed a small blade into your palm. It felt too light to do the thing he expected. When he walked away, you almost called him back, almost demanded he explain. But you didn't. Because in that moment, all you could see was the shape of tomorrow. Bread you could buy, shelter you could rent, a few hours without the gnawing in your belly. Later, you would pretend you'd been tricked, that you hadn't known. But as you crouched in the alley behind the tannery, waiting for the stranger whose name you hadn't even asked, you knew. Mainstream historical accounts claim professional assassins were organized, disciplined, members of secret guilds sworn to codes older than memory. You smile at that. If there were ever codes, you never got your copy. The man came at dusk, humming to himself, a small sack slung over his shoulder. You moved because you had to. Because if you didn't, you'd be back in the mud, starving, and you couldn't face that again. The blade slipped. It wasn't clean. You were clumsy. You were 13. When it was over, you stared at your shaking hands. They didn't look different. Neither did the street. The world hadn't shifted to reflect the enormity of what you'd done. You felt cheated by that. And then, relieved. You cleaned the blade in a trough, hid it under your tunic, and waited for the man with the scar. He paid you 4 coins, each stamped with a king you'd never met. You told yourself you'd never do it again, that you'd find honest work, any work. But by the next morning, you were hungry again. You think sometimes about how thin the line was between the boy you might have been and the boy you became. How easily it all tilted from surviving to killing. It still does. You crouch behind a sagging fence post, breathing slow, counting heartbeats. It's not just habit anymore. It's ritual. The quiet before a job feels almost holy, though you'd never say that aloud. You've learned that reverence isn't reserved for priests or kings. Sometimes it belongs to the people who can end a life with the same calm they use to butter bread. The night smells of manure and sweet rot. A lantern flickers 2 houses down, throwing crooked shadows across the road. You study the ground, memorizing the pebbles and straw, so that if you must run, your feet will already know the way. You didn't always prepare this carefully. In the beginning, you thought skill came from intention, that if you focused hard enough, you'd never make mistakes. That illusion lasted until your 3rd job. A merchant, fat on stolen tariffs, was your target, or so the woman who paid you claimed. You trailed him for 2 days through the market, the ale house, the brothel. On the 3rd evening, you made your move in the narrow lane behind the tanner's shop. You meant to be precise, but your blade caught his belt first, tearing it free. Coins scattered. He turned too quickly. You slipped. When the blade finally sank in, it was at an angle no guide had ever described. He didn't die right away. You stayed long enough to watch his eyes fade from shock to confusion to nothing. Historians still argue whether medieval assassins were taught exact anatomy, where to cut for speed, for silence, for certainty. You didn't have that luxury. You learned by doing, by failing. You wipe your palms against your cloak and exhale. This is how it always goes. Even now, years later, you feel that first panic whenever the moment comes. The dread that you'll fumble, that you'll leave someone half dead, moaning for a mercy you're too slow to give. After that botched kill, you tried to improve. You paid a toothless surgeon a week's wages to let you watch him carve up the dead. You memorized which veins spurted when nicked, which organs caved under a blade. The knowledge stuck to you like grease. But knowledge didn't prevent mistakes. Like the time you used poison, hoping for an elegant solution. You ground monkshood into a fine powder, folded it into a crust of bread, and waited. The man ate it all, then asked if you'd bring him another. He died 2 days later, raving and thrashing, while you lay awake, tasting the guilt like bile. After that, you stopped believing in clean endings. You shift position, careful not to kick the fence. Your target tonight is a courier, a thin man with a nervous cough. He carries messages for a baron who once burned your village. You tell yourself it's justice, though you don't really believe that anymore. It's just a job. Your knife is the same chipped one you took off a guard who died in his sleep. You've sharpened it so many times it's nearly a toothpick, but it still cuts. You run your thumb along the edge, feeling for burrs. Mainstream tales love to depict assassins as masters of exotic weapons, spiked garrots, hidden blades that spring from sleeves. You laugh at that. Your arsenal is whatever you can steal or barter. A kitchen knife, a brick, a length of cord. Tonight, it's the knife. You close your eyes and imagine the steps. Wait for the courier to pass. Stand. Step close. Slide the blade beneath the ribs. You try not to think about how it will feel when he sags against you. A dog barks 2 streets over. Your heart doesn't race this time. That's the difference between you and the amateurs. You don't get rattled by echoes. You only flinch for real threats. Your breath fogs the air. You watch it dissipate. Remembering that second kill still tightens your throat. The one that taught you hesitation is a luxury you can't afford. A guard captain who'd beaten half the town into silence. You tracked him to a stable. He was drunk, muttering about debts and women and the cost of loyalty. You didn't hesitate. Just one thrust, just behind the collarbone. He never made a sound. You waited to feel something, satisfaction, regret. But all you felt was relief. Relief that you hadn't failed again. That was the night you understood. Every death would teach you something, whether you wanted the lesson or not. Historians still debate whether killers like you were driven by ideology or simple coin. You don't know what to call your motive. It's not hatred, not justice. It's survival and a hunger to prove, if only to yourself, that you can finish what you start. Footsteps echo at the corner. The courier. Right on time. You flex your fingers. The blade rests lightly in your palm, more familiar than your own name. You step forward. You move before your thoughts can catch up. The blade glides forward, guided more by repetition than any spark of malice. A soft grunt, a stagger, then the courier collapses into your arms, lighter than you expected. The moment always feels smaller than the stories make it sound. You ease him down, one hand clamped over his mouth. You feel the flutter of his last breath against your wrist, warm as steam. Then it's gone, leaving only weight and the echo of something final. It never feels noble, never righteous, just necessary. You check the satchel out of reflex. A few coins, a folded scrap of vellum sealed with red wax. You don't break the seal. You tell yourself that makes you honorable in some way, though you know better. You're only here to finish the list someone else started. When you wipe the blade against his cloak, your hands don't tremble. You used to wait for that trembling, convinced it meant you still had a conscience. Now, the stillness just feels efficient. Mainstream chronicles claim assassins took trophies, rings, locks of hair, trinkets to mark each kill. You've never understood that. You already carry enough reminders inside your ribs. You leave the body folded against the wall and drift into the side street, letting your steps dissolve into the quiet. No one calls out. No doors creak open. If anyone glimpses you, they'll forget by morning. You walk for hours before you find the stable, one of those old, bow-legged buildings half swallowed by brambles. You slip inside, past sagging beams and a wheelbarrow filled with moldy hay. The air is cold enough to sting your nose, but that's a comfort. The cold keeps you alert. You lower yourself into a corner and think about that first kill again. You were so certain it would change you forever, that you'd wake up every morning tasting guilt, seeing his eyes in every stranger. But you were wrong. It wasn't the guilt that stayed. It was the familiarity. The way your body learned the motions before your mind caught up. Over time, the memory softened, not because you grew numb, but because you had to make space for all the others. A ledger too full to linger on any single name. You adjust your cloak around your knees and trace the spine of your knife, feeling each nick where steel met bone or brick or another blade. You remember the lessons each scar taught you, lessons you'd have paid anything not to learn. Once, you tried to mimic the fighting stance of a soldier you watched sparring in a muddy yard. Feet wide, shoulders squared, blade angled like a snake's fang. You looked impressive for about 10 seconds, until the target pivoted and you slipped on cobblestones slick with rain. Historians still argue whether medieval assassins received formal training, some organized system of discipline and instruction. You could answer them. No, you learned by failing. By surviving the mistakes no one would forgive. After that slip, you spent a month practicing alone. You stabbed grain sacks until the straw turned brown. You learned how to move your feet without looking, how to keep your breath steady while someone died in your arms. You tried poison again, hoping for something cleaner. Foxglove, monkshood, roots ground to powder beneath your boot heel. But the first time you used it, the mark collapsed mid-sentence, seizing so violently he cracked his skull on the hearthstone. Everyone screamed. We were still in the room. You learned another truth. Poison isn't silent. It just delays the noise. You started to prefer the blade. You could trust its honesty. Once, in a village whose name you can't recall, you killed a man with a kitchen knife so dull it tore instead of cutting. He bled out on the floorboards, gasping your false name with every breath. You stayed until his voice failed. You never knew why. You were younger then. You thought staying meant you respected the dead. Now you know, it just meant you didn't trust yourself to run. You close your eyes, but sleep doesn't come. It never does right after a job. Your body still hums with tension, some leftover instinct demanding you watch the door. You think about that second kill, a guard captain who deserved every inch of the blade. He'd extorted the town for years, beaten men and women senseless. No one mourned him. You thought that would make it easier, but it didn't. Because in the end, you're not killing evil. You're ending a heartbeat, and that feels the same, no matter whose chest you pierce. Outside, dawn pulls at the darkness. A rooster calls, thin and uncertain, as though it knows the world is about to wake and judge it. You flex your fingers. No tremor. That, more than any memory, tells you how far you've come and how far you've fallen. You think sometimes about the boy you were, the one who believed every death would be the last, that if you just earned enough coin, you could stop. He was wrong. Because once you learn how to do this, you learn something worse. It's never just one time. It's every time. Over and over, until the day you can't remember who you were before the blade. And even then, you keep going. Because the hunger never really leaves. It just changes shape. The hunger shifts, but never disappears. You discover that after your 10th kill, when the silver feels too light and the quiet too loud, you start to suspect that survival isn't your real motive anymore. You're here because you don't know how to be anywhere else. You used to tell yourself you'd stop once you'd saved enough. Enough for what? You're not sure. A small farm, maybe? A clean bed? Some place where your name didn't taste borrowed. But each time you think you're close, something intervenes. A client who vanishes without paying, a town that burns before you can collect, or the simple fact that your hands won't stay clean long enough to build anything lasting. You once accepted a contract from a woman with soft eyes and a voice that never rose above a whisper. She called you friend, even as she slid a purse across the table. You believed her for exactly the span of one heartbeat. Then you remembered the rule you'd learned in the first months. Never trust the client. Historians still debate whether contracts were written, signed, sealed in blood or wax or something more exotic. You could tell them, no parchment ever crossed your palm. No ceremony. Just a nod, a coin, and the understanding that you would disappear when the job was done. The woman's target was a rival merchant. She insisted he deserved it, claimed he'd bankrupted her family, stolen her ships, left her children begging in the mud. You didn't care. Not really. But she spoke with such conviction that for a moment, you wished you did. You found the merchant outside the city walls, counting barrels beneath a torn awning. He looked tired, ordinary, the kind of man who might have done terrible things or might have simply survived them. You didn't ask which. You just waited for the guards to drift away before you moved. It was quick, quicker than most. A neat line beneath his jaw. He tried to speak, but the words drowned in blood. You held him upright so he wouldn't thrash and make a scene. When you returned, the woman was gone. The tavern door was bolted. The barkeep wouldn't meet your eyes. You left without knocking. 3 days later, you learned the truth. The merchant was her husband. She hadn't lost her ships. She'd lost her temper. You were her instrument. Nothing more. You'd like to say you regretted it, that you mourned the part you played in a petty revenge. But all you really felt was tired. Tired and aware that no amount of caution would ever keep you safe from other people's lies. You walk now with your head down, your hood drawn low. Every town blurs into the next. Mud streets, shuttered windows, children who stare too long before their mothers pull them away. You have a name here, but it isn't yours. You've stopped keeping track of how many you've used. Once, you tried to list them in a ledger, each alias a different version of yourself. Thomas, Marek, Ghislaine. Names you wore like cloaks. Names you shed when they grew too heavy. Mainstream chronicles like to imagine assassins as legends. One figure, singular, eternal. You know better. You are a dozen different people, none of them real. Tonight, you sleep in a hayloft that smells of mouse droppings and old rain. You lay your knife beside you, the same chipped blade that's seen more of your life than any human ever will. You wonder if it judges you, if steel can hold memory. The hay pricks your skin through your threadbare cloak. You close your eyes and let your mind drift, not to the faces you've ended, but to the faces you've borrowed. The time you posed as a healer in a plague-stricken village. You wore a leather mask and dabbed vinegar on wounds you didn't understand. When the town started to recover, you disappeared before anyone could ask your real name. The month you pretended to be a grieving widow, wrapped in black and silent as the grave you claimed to mourn. People pitied you, offered bread. You almost forgot it was an act. Or the night you posed as a mute stable hand, mucking stalls for 3 weeks while you waited for your mark to drop his guard. You slept beside the horses, dreaming of hoofbeats and quiet fields you'd never see. You wonder sometimes if you've lost track of who you started as, if you ever had a self that wasn't a mask. A dog barks outside, breaking your thoughts. You tense before you realize it's too far away to be a threat. Your heart slows. Cold seeps back into your bones. You think of the boy you once spared, a witness with eyes too wide to lie. He'd seen everything. Your blade, your face, the name you'd given that week. And yet, he'd said nothing, just watched you go. Historians still argue whether professional killers held any lines they wouldn't cross, whether there was a code or just expedience. You suppose that's one thing you still believe. You don't kill children. You've been offered coin, more than enough to buy the quiet life you pretend to want. But you always say no. You're not sure if that makes you decent or simply cowardly in one specific way. The wind rattles the boards overhead. You shift, pulling your cloak tighter. You used to pray in moments like this, quiet words to a God you never truly believed in. Now you just listen to the wind, to your breath, to the silence that follows every death. You think about the way people look at you when they realize who you are. The fear, the disgust, the relief when you pass them by. You don't mind it. It's better than the alternative, better than trust, because trust is what got you here, and trust is what will finish you someday. Section 5. The knife you carry has a chip near the hilt, a flaw you can feel even through the linen wrap around the grip. You remember exactly how it happened. A weaver, thin as a whip, swung a wooden shuttle at your head the moment you slipped through the door. The blade turned in your hand, caught the beam instead of his ribs. The crack of steel on oak echoed in your bones. He lived 2 more days before you found him again, huddled in the parish shed, praying you'd forget he existed. You didn't forget. You never do. That's one of the cruelties no one bothers to mention. The work teaches you to remember everything you wish you could ignore. When you inventory your tools, you feel the smallness of your life. There's no gleaming assassin's kit, no perfectly ordered array of polished implements. Just what you can steal, barter, or hold on to long enough to matter. You have a garrote, thin as wire, hidden in your boot. A second knife, smaller and curved, a shape meant to finish what the first begins. A vial of powder that tastes like almonds when the seal breaks, though you've learned not to trust poison's promise of elegance. You carry 2 pairs of gloves, one for warmth, one for grip. You used to think that was excessive. Now you know better. Cold fingers slip, and you only get one chance. Historians still argue whether killers like you prepared rituals before each job, prayers, meditations, charms for protection. You've never had that kind of faith. The closest you come is the way you check your kit before you leave a hiding place. Each item in its place, each blade clean, each line of escape mapped in your head until it blurs the edges of your thoughts. Tonight you're in a hayloft with a broken ladder and a door that won't close. Your breath shows in little ghosts. You sit cross-legged, cloak around your shoulders, tools arranged before you like a shrine. The chipped knife, the crescent blade, the garrote, coiled and silent. Once, you owned a crossbow small enough to slip beneath your cloak. You lost it in a river crossing. The man you were chasing never made it across. You think about that sometimes, the way his hands vanished beneath the current, how quiet the water looked afterward. You replaced the crossbow with a butcher's knife. It's not elegant, but it does what you ask of it. You pull the main blade closer and test the edge with your thumb. Still sharp, still honest. Mainstream tales love to depict assassins as shadows clad in perfect black, faces hidden by masks that strike fear into the hearts of the righteous. You know the truth. Fear comes from the unexpected, not the theatrical. You've worn a baker's apron, a monk's robe, a beggar's rags. You've smiled at men you were paid to unmake, and they never suspected. You once dressed as a healer, your pockets lined with herbs you couldn't name, and walked through a noble's household unseen. The cook offered you a crust of bread. You took it. Later that night, you ended the Lord's line with a single stroke. You remember the bread more vividly than the kill. That's how it works. The kills blur, the kindnesses don't. A rat scurries across the rafters. You watch it with the same measured indifference you use on everything that isn't your problem. You could kill it, but you don't. Not tonight. You unfold a scrap of linen from your kit, a tiny sliver of mirror tucked inside, just enough to see around corners. You angle it toward your face. Your reflection startles you. You've worn so many masks that you've stopped expecting to recognize the eyes behind them. Tonight, they look hollow, watchful. The eyes of someone who's learned too many ways to end a life and not enough ways to live one. You set the mirror aside. Once, a man offered you a blade, etched with runes. He said it could cut through guilt as easily as flesh. You laughed in his face, not because you doubted the magic, but because you knew there's no steel in the world that can carve away the memories that follow you to sleep. You wrap the chipped knife's hilt again, tightening the linen until it bites your palm. You think of the first time you realized your tools had become more familiar than any person. You were sitting in a pigsty, waiting for dawn, your hand resting on your knife like it was a friend. You remember the ache in your chest, the sharp knowledge that you traded every hope of belonging for the certainty of control. Historians still debate whether killers like you felt pride in their skill or shame in their necessity. You suspect both are true. Outside, the wind changes direction. You feel it in your bones. You always do. You gather your tools, slip them into their hiding places. One in your boot, one in your sleeve, the rest close enough to reach without thinking. The weight is comforting. You stand and stretch the stiffness from your back. For a moment, you imagine what it would be like to use your hands for something else, to build, to plant, to hold. But the thought passes, because in the end, you know the truth. These tools don't care who you are. They only care that you keep moving. And so you do. Death, when you deliver it, is rarely clean. It doesn't come on silent wings, doesn't slip through the dark like a polite guest. It thrashes and claws and stains everything it touches. But afterward, when the last shudder stops and the quiet seeps back in, it feels almost gentle. Almost. You've learned that the silence after a kill is worse than any noise. In that hush, you feel the weight of what you've done stack itself inside your ribs. You can forget the name, the face, the pleading, but you never forget the moment the world goes still. You once thought the stillness would be your reward, that when you ended a life, the air would clear and leave you with something close to peace. Instead, it feels like standing in a room you don't remember entering, listening for footsteps that never come. Historians still argue whether killers in the medieval world felt remorse, whether executioners or spies broke down after the work was done. You suspect they did, but not in public. You've seen soldiers cry over a fresh grave at dawn, then wipe their eyes and joke about supper. You learned early that shame and survival can share the same skin. Tonight, the stable is empty, except for you and the smell of old straw. You sit with your back against the cold boards, knees pulled to your chest. You trace the seam of your boot with one finger, trying to ground yourself in something real. A memory creeps in. The boy you killed by mistake. He couldn't have been more than 14, though your client called him a spy. Maybe he was. Maybe he was just unlucky. You didn't ask. You did your job. And when he fell, you knelt beside him and told yourself you wouldn't flinch when he stopped breathing. You flinched anyway. You told yourself you'd remember his name, that you'd carry it as penance. But it's gone now, lost somewhere between the dozens of other names you promised not to forget. The faces stay, though, especially in dreams. Sometimes you see them watching you from doorways, their mouths moving in silent accusation. Other times, they're just there, standing in fields, sitting in taverns, doing nothing but reminding you that you took something you can't ever give back. You've tried everything to quiet them. Prayer, drink, distance. Nothing works, so you've learned to live with them. You shift in the hay, listening to the wind claw at the eaves. Once, you killed a scribe. A simple job. He knew something he shouldn't. You slipped into his chamber at dusk, thinking it would be easy. He looked up when you crossed the threshold. He said your name, not the name you were using that week, your real name. You don't know how he knew. You didn't stay to ask. That night, you dreamed of parchment unraveling itself, words bleeding across the floor. You woke up gasping. For days after, you couldn't look at ink without feeling sick. You never took another contract on a scribe. Not because you grew a conscience, but because you didn't want to risk hearing your name again. Mainstream stories claim assassins choose their life for coin or revenge or thrill. You wish you could say it was that simple. For you, it started with hunger. It continued because you had nothing else. And it endures because it's the only thing you do without failing. The stable creaks. Glance at the rafters, waiting for something, anything, to break the hush. But there's no one here to witness you. That's the worst part of all this. Not the violence, not the fear, the loneliness. Once, a dog followed you for 3 days. Some farmer's mongrel, ribs showing through its patchy fur. You tried to shoo it, but it kept pace behind you, tail wagging. You almost let it stay. almost. But you knew better. The dog would have ended up another thing you had to bury. So, on the fourth morning, you left before dawn, walking until your feet bled, and you were sure it couldn't find you again. Historians still debate whether nomadic killers felt loyalty to anyone but themselves. You suspect they didn't, because loyalty makes you predictable. Predictable people die young. You pull your knees tighter, feeling the cold creep under your cloak. You used to wonder what would happen if you stopped running, if you laid down your tools and let the past catch you. You don't wonder anymore, because you know. You've seen what happens to people who try to leave this life behind. They're found, eventually, in ditches or wells, or nailed to the door of a church as a warning. Better to keep moving. Better to be the ghost no one can quite remember. You close your eyes, listening to your heartbeat. It's steady. That's all that matters. Tomorrow, you'll move on. Another town, another name, another quiet room where someone stops breathing. And after the echo fades, you'll sit in the dark again, waiting for the silence to feel like something other than punishment. It never does. You don't walk like other people anymore. Somewhere along the way, you forgot how to move without calculating each step, how to simply exist in a place without first mapping the exits, the shadows, the things that can be turned into weapons. You've trained your stride to slide between the creaks in a floorboard, to glide across gravel without a sound. You don't even have to think about it. Your body just does what the years have taught it. It makes you efficient. It also makes you a ghost. You slip through alleys and doorways without leaving a trace. When people glance your way, their gaze slides off you, as if you're no more important than a ragged curtain. That's the goal. Be forgettable, because the moment someone remembers your face, you become vulnerable. Once, you spent a week in a town so small it didn't have a proper tavern. You posed as a potter's mute apprentice. You carried buckets, mended kiln cracks, swept the same square floor over and over. No one asked your name. They thought they knew you. A silent boy with smudged hands and a shy nod. When your mark finally returned, an old merchant with a price on his head, you ended it cleanly in the dark behind his shop. The next morning, you left before sunrise. No one tried to stop you. No one even looked up. Historians still argue whether medieval assassins cultivated anonymity as a strategy, or simply because they had no other life. You could tell them, it's both. You didn't choose to vanish. You learned that being invisible is the only way to keep surviving. You passed through town squares like a cold draft, felt, but never quite noticed. You remember the first time you realized you were disappearing, even from yourself. It was in a border village where you traded your last coins for a new cloak. You caught your reflection in a cracked window, a stranger in dull fabric, shoulders slouched, eyes empty. You turned away before the memory could settle. Once, you posed as a wandering healer. A woman thanked you for saving her son's life. You almost told her the truth, that you'd stolen your supplies, that your knowledge was cobbled together from observation and desperation. Instead, you nodded and moved on before she could ask your name. That's how it always goes. You never stay long enough to be thanked or blamed. You've learned to leave before attachment can root itself. It's easier that way. Cleaner. There was a time you believed you'd find a place you wouldn't want to leave. A town small enough a roof sturdy enough, a life quiet enough. But every time you tried, you felt the same prickle between your shoulders, a warning that the past was catching up, that your name was passing between hands in some dim chamber miles away. You've fled in the night more times than you can count. You once left a place you liked, a river town with cobbled streets and a market that smelled of fresh bread, because a woman looked at you too long while you counted coppers. She smiled, not the vacant courtesy of a stranger, but recognition. That was enough. You walked out before the hour changed, taking only what you could carry. Mainstream chronicles pretend that assassins were feared legends, invincible wraiths who glided through walls and left no witnesses. You know the truth. Most of the time, you're just the person no one can quite remember. That's why you've survived. You sit now in a barn that smells of old hay and mouse droppings, your back pressed to the wall. Your tools are hidden in the folds of your cloak, weightless in your mind. You close your eyes and imagine what it would be like to be seen, not as a threat, not as a rumor, but as something real, a person with a name that belonged only to you. You try to remember the last time someone spoke that name. It's been years. You can't even hear it in your mind anymore. Just a muffled echo, blurred at the edges. You once told yourself you'd reclaim it someday, that you'd stand in a place long enough for someone to ask, and you'd answer without hesitation. But each season that passes makes it harder to believe. You open your eyes to the darkness and listen to the wind scrape across the boards. You wonder if this is how ghosts feel, adrift in places they used to love, unseen by the living, remembered only as a chill at the edge of the hearth. A rat scurries along the rafters, its tiny feet scratching at the beams. You don't flinch. You've shared more rooms with vermin than people these last years. They don't care who you are. They don't ask questions. There's a kind of peace in that. You shift, adjusting your cloak. The movement is soundless, practiced. You think of the boy you once spared, his wide eyes, his shaking hands. You wonder if he tells stories about you, if he turned you into something larger than life to make sense of the moment you let him run. Historians still argue whether killers like you carried regret or simply folded it into their silence. You suspect regret is a luxury. You carry something simpler, awareness. You know what you've done. You know what you'll do again. And you know why you never stay in one place long enough to be more than a passing rumor. Because in the end, it's safer to be forgotten. They never look afraid. Not the clients. They look bored or impatient or a little too curious, like they're sampling a rare delicacy they'll only taste once. You've watched men in velvet doublets and women in dresses that cost more than your entire life lean across a table, flick a coin between their fingers, and ask you to end someone as if they were ordering wine. You've come to expect the small gestures that betray them, the way they glance at the door before they speak, the way their hands hover over the purse, like they'd rather not touch it, the way their eyes drift past you instead of meeting your gaze. You used to think that meant they were ashamed. Now you know better. They just don't see you as a person. You're a blade they rent, a consequence they outsource. Nothing more. You prefer it that way, because the moment someone tries to treat you like anything human, you start to remember that you once were. And that makes the work harder. Mainstream historians love to paint assassins as agents of grand intrigue, moving pieces on a board no one else could see. You've never seen a board, just people who want other people dead. You once met a client in a bathhouse, steam curling around you both like a living thing. He lounged on a marble bench, hair slicked back, a gold ring on every finger. He offered you a coin with the same hand he used to ladle perfumed water onto his shoulders. He never said the target's name aloud, just wrote it on a scrap of linen and pressed it into your palm. When you unwrapped it later, you recognized the name. Someone you'd known once. You didn't pause. You did the job. But afterward, when you returned to collect the rest of your payment, the man was gone. The bathhouse was locked. No one admitted to having seen you there. You burned the linen scrap in the gutter and walked on, your stomach hollow. You've learned the signs of a client who plans to betray you, the ones who smile too quickly, the ones who promise more work before the first is finished, the ones who talk about honor, as if the word means anything in your trade. Historians still argue whether assassins operated under formal codes, some script of conduct that protected them from the very people they served. You've never seen such a code. If it exists, it's nothing but a myth designed to comfort the same merchants and nobles who think a silver coin buys loyalty. You once accepted a job from a baron's steward. The steward promised payment upon completion, of course. You insisted on half up front. He laughed and said, "We're men of honor here." You smiled, and you never returned. It was a lesson you'd already learned too many times. The ones who mention honor are always the first to draw a blade for your back. So you adapted. You began to take payment in places no one would expect. An empty field at dawn, the crypt beneath a ruined church, the rear stall of a tanner's shed. You developed a ritual. Half the money before, the other half never. Because if someone's willing to pay you once, they'll always be willing to betray you later. You've accepted payment in all sorts of forms: jewels, letters of credit, the promise of a favor that never comes. But silver remains the most honest. It has no pretense. It clinks in your palm, reassuring and cold. Once, a client tried to pay you in land. A small orchard, he said, big enough to start over. For a moment, you were tempted. You pictured trees heavy with fruit, the smell of warm earth, the taste of something you'd grown yourself, but you knew better. Land is an anchor, an invitation to be found. You walked away without replying. Mainstream tales say that killers like you grew arrogant, that the more you survived, the more invincible you felt. You wish that were true. In reality, every year makes you more cautious, more convinced that the next job will be the one you don't walk away from. You've started to notice how clients look at you when they think you aren't watching. A flicker of fear, a moment of calculation. You know that in their minds, they're already deciding whether you're more valuable, alive, or dead. You've turned that awareness into a kind of armor. You never meet the same client twice in the same place. You never show them how you work. You never give them a reason to think you might care. Because caring is leverage, and leverage gets you killed. You think about the man you killed by mistake, the one whose name was written wrong on a slip of parchment. You still remember the look on his face when you turned him over. Surprise, then relief, then nothing. The client never apologized. just handed you the rest of the payment as if nothing had happened. That was when you learned your final rule. No matter how carefully you plan, how thoroughly you vanish, you are always disposable to the people who hire you. You finish your work. You take your coin. You walk away. Because the moment you stay, the moment you trust, is the moment they decide they don't need you anymore. And you've seen what happens to the ones who stay too long. You stopped leaving footprints years ago. Not in the literal sense. Everybody leaves marks on the ground. But you learned how to walk in ways that slip out of memory before they even fade from the dirt. You know exactly how to tread through mud without splashing, how to press down on fresh snow so it doesn't crack. You've learned how to pass a guard close enough to feel the warmth of his lantern and leave him swearing he saw no one at all. It's not magic. It's practice and fear. You used to tell yourself you'd only need to live this way for a little while, that you'd work enough jobs to buy your escape, a farm beyond the borders, a cottage behind a hidden tree line, a place where you could wake up in the same bed for more than a week, where you could answer to a name that never changed. But the road kept pulling you forward, one job after another, one disguise after another. You've walked so long and so far that you've forgotten where you thought you were going. Now every place you enter feels temporary before you've even seen it properly. A shape in the fog. A name you don't bother to learn. A roof you won't sleep under twice. Once, you stayed too long in a coastal village with gulls crying over the roofs and children who asked you questions you couldn't answer. You mended a fence for a widow there, carried water. You almost let your shoulders fall, almost let yourself believe you could rest. But you heard it, the sound you always know to listen for. The pause in the morning chatter, the quick shuffle of boots outside your door. A single knock. You didn't look through the shutters. You didn't open the latch. You simply climbed out the back, left your boots by the hearth so they'd think you were still sleeping, and walked away barefoot into the marsh. By nightfall, you were 15 miles away, your feet raw and your chest hollow. You never found out who knocked. Historians still argue whether killers like you could survive indefinitely without going mad, whether constant motion corrodes the soul. You could answer that easily. It does, just not all at once. It chips at you in small, relentless cuts. Until one morning, you look in the stream and don't recognize the reflection staring back. Once, you crossed a border disguised as a nun. The real nuns in the caravan never questioned you. One pressed a sprig of rosemary into your hand, told you God would guide your steps. You kept it, tucked in the seam of your cloak. Not because you believe it will protect you, but because it's the last thing anyone ever gave you without expecting something in return. Travel by avoidance now. You don't use the roads unless you must. You don't stop in towns with stone walls and organized watches. You stay where no one bothers to look too closely. Sometimes you pass through a village so quickly that by dusk, you can't remember its name. Just the crooked angles of the roofs, the sag of an old sign, scent of cabbage soup drifting from a window you never knocked on. You used to believe you'd find a place that felt different. A town where you'd stop counting exits and sleep through the dawn. But every time you tried, the feeling returned. That prickle between your shoulders that told you the past was already on your trail. so you left. Every time. You've watched the same patterns play out over and over. A baker offering you bread. A child with wide eyes who asked your name. A shopkeeper who nodded like he almost recognized your face. And you always chose the same answer: movement. Because belonging is the first step toward being known. And being known is the first step toward being hunted. Mainstream tales love to say that people like you become legends, names whispered over fires, stories traded by soldiers and thieves. But you know the truth. Most of the time, you're just a blank shape that passes through other people's lives, a draft of cold air that never leaves a mark. You tell yourself that's safer, that it's better to be a rumor than a memory. But there are nights you wonder if you've stopped being a person altogether. You once stayed in a river town for nearly a month, longer than anywhere else. You slept in the loft of a brewer's barn. In the mornings, you helped stack barrels, carried grain. The brewer's daughter gave you a slice of honeyed bread when she thought no one was watching. You almost smiled at her, almost told her your real name. Then you saw the guards riding in, asking questions you knew too well. You left before dusk, carrying nothing but your tools and the taste of something you didn't have a word for. You never passed that way again. Tonight, you're camped in a barn that smells of rotting hay and old straw. The wind rasps through the boards like it's trying to find you, even here. You watch the moon drift between the rafters and think about the boy you spared, the one who saw everything and never spoke. You wonder if he tells stories about you, if he remembers the way you looked back at him before you vanished into the dark. Historians still argue whether assassins ever felt the weight of the lives they passed by, the kindnesses they left behind in their flight. You think that's the part no one writes down, because that's what makes this life unbearable. Not the killing, the leaving. You wrap your cloak tighter around your shoulders and rest your hand on the hilt of your chipped blade. You don't know if you're running towards something or just away, but for now, you're still moving. And sometimes, that's the only choice left. You've seen war, not the kind they put in paintings. No bright banners snapping over sunlit fields. No knights with shining armor framed against a sky clear as a blessing. You've seen the real war, the kind that smells like mildew and spoiled rations, and the iron tang of blood that never quite washes out of your skin. The kind that grinds men into things smaller than fear. You never became a killer because of war, but it certainly made it easier to stay one. When everyone is dying, no one looks too closely at why someone in a borrowed tabard is still standing while others fall. No one questions why a stranger has no badge, no insignia, no past. You learned early that the chaos of armies is the perfect cover. You could slip into a camp before dawn, disappear behind a row of tents, and leave when the sun came up with no one the wiser. You pretended to be a soldier once, wearing a rusted breastplate you took from a corpse. No one questioned you. Everyone was too tired, too hungry, too bruised by the cold. The line between the living and the soon-to-be dead was thin, and nobody wasted energy defending it. Historians still argue whether assassins shaped the course of battles, if single blades in the dark toppled whole campaigns. You could tell them, yes, but not in the way they think. You never killed a king. You never poisoned an emperor. You killed the men who carried messages, The quartermasters who stretched rations too long. The lieutenants whose competence threatened to drag a war out for another year. Wars don't end with heroic charges. They end when the food runs out, when the maps vanish, when a scout doesn't come back. You learned that quickly. You remember the first time you were paid to start a fire, not to burn a building, just to scatter the men who thought they were safe. It was an engineer's tent, filled with ink and plans and neat rows of supplies. You left a spark tucked in the folds of an oiled canvas. By dawn, half the siege lines were in ashes. You walked away before the sun rose, the smoke at your back. You didn't feel proud. You didn't feel much at all. There was a surgeon you were paid to silence, a thin, stoop-shouldered man who saved more lives in a week than you ever destroyed. You watched him through the canvas of a medical tent, listening to the way he murmured to each patient. He actually believed their names mattered. It almost stopped you. But hunger and necessity are stronger than pity. You slipped inside at dusk. By the time you left, the tent was empty and the infection did the rest. Sometimes your knife did more than any regiment could have accomplished. Mainstream tales like to pretend there is a difference between soldiers and people like you. You've seen what happens when discipline unravels, when the ranks break and the proud become the desperate. In the end, everyone is capable of the same violence. Some of them just get medals for it. You once helped a village prepare for an assault. Not because they paid you, because you were limping, half-starved, and they gave you a place by the hearth without asking your name. You showed them how to rig a door with a tripwire, how to foul the wells so no army could drink. They thanked you. 2 months later, you saw the smoke rising from a ridge 20 miles away. You didn't go back. You told yourself you knew what you'd find. But you still think about the little girl who watched you with those 2 bright eyes, clutching a wooden sword you carved from a scrap of pine. Sometimes, in your quieter moments, you wonder if she survived, but you never let yourself dwell on it for long. Once, you heard a general boasting that he could end a war in a month if he found the one who moves without tracks. You didn't stay to hear the rest, because if he ever found you, he'd have offered more silver than you'd ever seen, and you'd have taken it, and you would have stayed, and staying gets you killed. Historians still debate whether mercenaries like you ever fought out of conviction, out of some shred of belief. You could answer that too. You never did. You fought because it kept you alive. Because in a war, everyone is too busy dying to wonder why you're there. The barn you're in tonight still smells faintly of old smoke. Some forgotten skirmish that left only scorched beams and blackened straw. You settle into the shadows, your tools laid out in the straw. You wonder sometimes if you've carried war with you wherever you go, if the quiet you keep chasing doesn't exist anymore. You think of the men you killed not because they deserved it, but because they were in the way. Cooks, scribes, the boy who held the captain's horse and saw too much. You wish you could say you felt guilt, but mostly you felt tired. Tired and aware that there is no clean end to any of it. That's what the stories never say. They talk about the last battle, the final stroke, but nothing ever ends. You just walk away and pretend the past doesn't follow. And some nights, you almost believe it. There's a town you keep dreaming about. You don't know if it ever existed, or if your mind stitched it together from scraps of places you passed through too quickly to remember. In the dream, the sky is always the same thick, indifferent gray. The streets a winding maze that feels like you've walked them 100 times, though you couldn't draw them if you tried. You stand in the square, where a market stall waits, empty, draped in linen that flutters without wind. You watch from a distance, and you never step closer, because some part of you knows that if you approach, if you peel back the linen and see what's beneath, you'll find something you can't carry with you when you wake. You always wake before you learn what it is. You've started to suspect that dream is your mind's way of showing you the life you never lived. The life you traded for the blade you still keep at your side. The life you abandoned the first time you chose not to run away hungry. Once, you tried to stay somewhere. A river town strung with little bridges and tiled roofs. You rented a room above a baker's shop, paid a month in advance, and pretended you were just another drifter with sore feet and no dark secrets. For 12 days, you swept the floors, carried flour sacks, and tried to learn how to smile at strangers without wondering which of them had seen you before. You almost believed you could belong there. Almost. Then, on the 13th morning, you looked up from the counter and saw a man standing across the square. A man you recognized, not because he'd ever spoken to you, but because you'd once seen him watching another killer work. You knew the look in his eyes, recognition, calculation, the knowledge that he'd found something valuable he could sell to someone else. You left before the sun reached the rooftops. You didn't even collect your pay. Historians still argue whether assassins like you ever found peace in peacetime. Whether you could adapt to a world where knives weren't needed. You think they already know the answer. You don't adapt. You endure. You stay sharp because softness is fatal. You keep your tools ready because the past never loses your trail for long. You pretend the ache in your chest is hunger when you know it's something else. You remember the boy you spared, the one with 2 big eyes and a mouth frozen open around the scream he never let out. Sometimes you wonder if he grew up to become the sort of man who hires people like you. If you only delayed the inevitable by letting him run, it would almost be easier if you'd killed him. At least then you'd know. That's the worst part of all this. Not the bodies, not the silver, the not knowing. Once you met a blind woman on the road. She stopped you with a hand on your sleeve. You tensed, ready to slip the blade from your belt, but she only lifted her palm to your face, tracing the lines there as if she could read them like a map. You feel tired, she said. Not wicked, not dangerous, not doomed, just tired. You nearly wept because in that moment, you understood that even a stranger could see the weight you carried. Tonight, you're lying in a loft with a roof so full of holes, the stars look like broken glass scattered above you. You pull your cloak tighter, but the wind still finds your skin. You used to think the blade was what turned you into this, that if you could throw it away, you'd be someone else again. Someone softer, someone real. But you've learned it isn't the steel that does the damage. It's the silence that comes after. Because each time you finish a job, each time you walk away from someone's last breath, you carry the quiet with you. you carry the echo of what you've done. The understanding that you can never go back to being the person who hesitated the first time someone asked if you'd kill for coin. Mainstream stories love to talk about redemption, about the killer who puts down his weapons and learns to grow things. You think those stories are a mercy people tell themselves because they'd rather believe a monster can turn human again than admit that monsters were human all along. You'd like to believe you could be more, but every time you try, you remember the way your hands feel when they close around the knife. Steady, grateful, almost relieved. Because the blade is honest in a way nothing else is. It doesn't pretend, it doesn't forgive, and it doesn't let you forget what you are. Once, you tried to leave it all behind. You walked north for 3 days, through fields full of frost and crows, and the promise of nothing. You thought you could outrun your past if you just kept moving. But when you woke on the 4th morning, the knife was still in your hand. You think of the dream town again, the market stall that waits, the old man who sometimes appears at the edge of your vision, scattering crumbs for birds you never see. You wonder what would happen if you walked up to that stall, if you asked for whatever it was selling. Peace, forgiveness, a reason to stop running. But you always wake before you find out. And when you open your eyes, you're still here, still breathing, still moving. Because even if you wanted to stop, you wouldn't know how. You close your eyes again and pretend, just for a moment, that the town is real, that you'll find it someday, and walk its streets without needing to count every door, that someone will look at you without fear, and that you'll remember how to look back without shame. But when the dawn comes, you'll stand, gather your tools, and go. Because whatever waits for you in that stall, you're not ready to claim it. Maybe you never will be. They say knowledge is power. You disagree. You've carried knowledge that felt more like a sickness, something that clings to your bones and spoils your sleep, a slow, cold rot that makes you suspicious of every kindness and disgusted by every certainty. You know things no one should know. You know exactly how long a man can stay conscious with a blade pressed against the notch between his ribs. You know how quickly a noble woman's face can empty of expression when she realizes the secret she sold isn't going to save her. You know that the most dangerous people in any city are never the ones who talk too much. They're the ones who never speak at all. You've learned that wars aren't decided by armies. They're decided in kitchens, in bedrooms, in quiet corners where desperate men and clever women whisper names. You've seen entire families erased because someone decided a rumor was too dangerous to let live, and you were the rumor's ending. Once, you intercepted a letter bound for a prince, a simple page sealed in blue wax. It looked like a request for grain. Inside was a cipher detailing how 3 households were to be extinguished. You didn't know their names. You didn't have to. You burned the letter. Then you ran. Because you understand that if you fail to deliver what you're paid for, you cease being a tool. You become a threat. And threats are never left alive. You've been hunted before. 3 men once followed you across half a country, calling themselves correctional agents. They moved with the patience of wolves and killed with the discipline of surgeons. For a week, you turned your path into a tangle, doubling back, setting fires, changing your hair, leaving false trails marked with someone else's blood. In the end, You didn't kill them. You turned them on each other. 2 died. The 3rd disappeared. Sometimes you hope he's still looking for you, because at least it would mean someone remembers. Historians still argue whether assassins held real political power. If you were pawns or king's hands in the dark, you know the truth. You were both. You were the quiet answer to every question that couldn't be solved with coin or treaty. You were the reminder that even princes bleed. And yet, there are no songs about you, no ledgers that record what you did, no statues to remember the man no one ever saw. You used to think that anonymity was a kind of mercy. Now you know it's the final insult, because you carry the memories whether anyone else does or not. You walk through the world with a mind that never shuts up, tallying every lie, every betrayal, every half-heard confession. You remember the names they whispered to you when they were too afraid to speak them aloud. You remember the faces of the ones who tried to buy their lives with tears, or flattery, or promises you never believed. You've learned to hear the intention beneath the words, to smell fear like rot in old bread. And worst of all, you've learned to understand. You know why the Baroness killed her sister. You know why the merchant sold his brother to the watch. You even understand the boy who saw you step into an alley and never called for help. Because desperation makes monsters of everyone eventually. You just got there first. Once, you tried to forget. You bought a vial of powder from a woman with too many rings on her fingers. She told you it would soften your memories, make the edges blur. You took it all at once. You woke 2 days later, under a tree, throat raw from crying, with no recollection of why you'd wept. You never tried again. Better to remember everything than risk forgetting who you are. Because the moment you stop knowing what you've done, you're not a person anymore. You're just the blade. You've kept journals sometimes, scratched notes into the margins of stolen ledgers, maps, names, descriptions of things you wished you'd never learned. You always burned them before you moved on, not because you feared being caught, because it's too easy to start believing your own legend. You once met a dying man who demanded to know why you'd come for him. You told him the truth. He nodded, thanked you. You left before he finished dying. You didn't want to see if he changed his mind. You think about him sometimes when the wind is too quiet. Mainstream tales like to claim that knowledge is a gift. That truth will set you free. You know better. Knowledge is a burden, a ledger no one else can read but you. And every time you open it, you add another line you'll never erase. Tonight, you lie awake in a hayloft, listening to the creak of old boards. You feel the weight of all the secrets you carry pressing down on your ribs. You wonder if someday it will crush you, if you'll simply lie down and let the silence swallow you whole. You almost welcome the thought, because at least it would mean an end. You close your eyes and think of the town you dreamed of, the market stall you never reached, the quiet you never earned, and you let yourself pretend, just for a moment, that you're not the sum of every ugly truth you've ever learned, that you're just a man, tired and cold, hoping morning won't come. You tried poison once. You thought it would be simpler than steel, cleaner, quieter, something you could do without looking into a person's eyes. You convinced yourself that if you didn't hear the last breath or feel the warmth leave their skin, it wouldn't weigh the same on your conscience. It didn't take long for that lie to unravel. The first time you prepared poison, you did it the way you'd heard in tavern stories. A mortar borrowed from an apothecary, a bundle of dried roots wrapped in waxy linen, and a book of half-finished recipes that smelled of mildew and ink. You ground everything together by candlelight until your hands ached and your knuckles were raw. You remember the scent, almonds and something sharp you could never name. It stuck in your nose for days, like a warning. You measured the powder 3 times. You told yourself you were being cautious, but in truth, you were stalling, hoping some excuse would come to make you stop. But nothing did. That night, you slipped into the back of a tavern with your heart beating so loud you thought everyone would hear it. You watched the merchant, broad-shouldered, red-faced, the kind of man who believed the world owed him something, sip ale between mouthfuls of stew. You crept to the barrel behind him. You tipped the vial into his cup, and you waited. He drank the whole thing, smacked his lips, and ordered another. You almost laughed. Instead, you walked out into the cold, bent over a rain barrel, and retched until your stomach cramped. 3 days later, you heard he'd choked to death on a chicken bone. The client sent payment anyway, tucked in a cloth pouch that smelled of lavender and contempt. You didn't feel satisfaction. You didn't feel anything at all. Historians still argue whether poison was truly the assassin's weapon of choice, or just a legend told by those who never had to wield it. You know the truth. Poison is desperation distilled. It's what you turn to when you don't have the strength or the courage to stand close enough to see what you've done. You tried again. Of course you did. The second time was worse. A magistrate with too many enemies and not enough sense to guard his wine. You paid a kitchen boy to leave you alone in the pantry, where the casks were stacked floor to ceiling. You worked by the flicker of a single candle, stirring powder into a jug of rich red vintage. You watched him drink it hours later, sitting at the head of a banquet table surrounded by sycophants and rivals. You watched his face pale, his eyes glaze over. You thought it would be like a slow falling asleep. Instead, he clawed at his throat and pitched forward, knocking platters to the floor. Someone screamed. Someone else shouted your name, though you hadn't drawn a blade, hadn't even moved. You slipped out through the servants' entrance. The smell of spilled wine and terror chasing you into the street. You didn't look back. You told yourself that was the last time you'd rely on something you couldn't hold in your palm. But you were lying to yourself, like you always did. Because the truth is, you wanted poison to be the answer. You wanted there to be a way to finish your work without carrying the weight of it. But poison is never clean. It lingers. It seeps into stories. It leaves questions behind that no blade ever does. Once, you tried a milder mixture, a tincture meant to cloud a mind, slow a heartbeat, nothing more. You told yourself it was mercy. You told yourself you'd give the man time to understand what was happening, to make peace with whatever he believed in. You mixed it into his soup and waited outside the window, counting your breaths. It worked at first. His spoon slowed. His head dipped forward. You thought finally something clean. Then he slipped sideways and never moved again. You climbed in to be sure, your shadow stretching over the hearth. The soup was still warm. You left the house before dawn, listening to your footsteps echo in the empty street. Mainstream tales like to say, poison is a coward's weapon. They're half right. It's for people who don't have the stomach to feel the life leaving a body, but still have the desperation to end it anyway. You think of that sometimes when you sit with your knives laid out in front of you, their edges catching the dim light. You know every groove, every nick in the steel. You trust them in a way you could never trust powder or tincture, because a blade doesn't pretend. A blade doesn't change its mind halfway through. A blade doesn't leave you wondering if you were the cause or if fate simply intervened. You sharpen them with the care some men reserve for prayer. Once, you tried to explain this to a woman who called herself a poisoner. You met her in a market square under a canvas awning that smelled of crushed herbs. She wore 6 rings on each hand and spoke in a voice so soft you had to lean close to hear. She told you she could mix a vial that would end a life in a single breath. You asked her why she preferred poison. She smiled, tired and sad, and said, "Because poison never screams." You never saw her again? But you think of her answer more often than you should. Because in your experience, poison does scream. It just waits until you're alone, until you're sure the danger is past, until the quiet is too heavy to bear. Then it starts whispering in your ear. It asks if you were ever in control at all. Tonight, you sit in an abandoned granary with your tools spread in neat rows. The air smells of old grain and damp wood. You run your thumb over the smallest blade, feeling its honesty. You think about all the times you tried to find a softer way, all the times it failed, and you close your eyes. Because even though you've tried to forget it, you still know the truth. No method is clean, no death is merciful, and no killer ever leaves their work behind. Not really. Because even if you find a way to set the blade aside, the silence it leaves is worse. It's a silence you can't outrun. And you've tried. You've tried every road, every disguise, every poison. And still, it follows you. Just like everything else. No one sings about you. No minstrels gather around firelight to tell stories of the work you've done. No children whisper your name as if it were a warning or a charm. No lover sighs over a ballad ending with your shadow slipping into the dawn. That's by design. You were never meant to be remembered. You are the hinge on a door no one notices until it swings shut. The missing brick in a wall that only matters when it collapses. The answer to a question no one dares to ask out loud. You're never the hero. You don't rescue anyone. You don't slay dragons or save kingdoms. You don't even get the privilege of being the villain in a story grand enough for a chronicler to care. You are something smaller, quieter. You've lived outcomes. You've lived consequences. And when you go, there may not even be a body to bury, let alone a marker carved with your real name. Once, you sat in a tavern nursing a cup of sour wine, while a bard stood in the corner, telling a tale that sounded too familiar to ignore. A shadowy figure, who moved unseen, slipped into the Baron's manor, and saved the realm by ending a tyrant in his sleep. You waited, half drunk, half hoping to hear some fragment of yourself in the telling. A word, a nod, anything. But the bard gave the credit to the prince who signed the order. You laughed into your cup, quietly, because that's the curse of being good at this. If you succeed, no one knows. And if they do know, you failed. Historians still argue whether assassins ever formed brotherhoods, some quiet league of killers bound by oaths and rituals. You've never met anyone who offered you that. You did once cross paths with four who thought they'd invented it. They called themselves the Lanterns. They wore matching tattoos on their wrists, a small flame no bigger than a coin. They said it meant they weren't alone, that they would watch each other's backs. 2 years later, you found the last of them stuffed in a wine barrel, the tattoo peeled off like a strip of old paint. That was the day you decided that no code is worth dying for. You don't belong to anyone. You don't answer to a council or a charter. You answer only to the necessity of staying alive. That's why you've had so many names, more than you can count, more than you can remember. Each one a mask you slipped on for as long as you needed it. Sometimes you think you can still taste the names on your tongue, even after you've spat them out. There was one you almost liked. Simple. Honest. It felt like the name of someone who might have lived a quiet life if things had gone differently. You used it for 3 months in a town that smelled of wet earth and baking bread. Then someone carved it into a stable wall, ringed with splashes of blood. A warning or a tribute. You never learned which. You left that night without a backward glance. Mainstream tales say that killers crave recognition, that you long for a reputation to precede you, to make your work easier. But you know a reputation is just another way to die. You've watched men die for their legend, their pride, their need to be seen. You've slipped past the bodies while the watchers were still gaping at the blood. You've learned it's better to be nothing at all. Once, you sat in a tavern beside a man who swore he'd met you. He told the barkeep a story about a killer in a midnight cloak with a voice like a funeral bell. You sat 2 stools away, drinking your cup of thin ale, listening to the details twist and tangle. He never looked at you. You left before he finished. That's the closest you've ever come to hearing your story told. And it wasn't yours. It never is. Tonight, you sit beneath the eaves of an abandoned mill, the rain drumming out a rhythm that almost feels like absolution. You watch the puddles fill, the shadows pool. You tell yourself that you don't mind being forgotten, that you prefer it. But there are nights like this, when the truth creeps in. You do want something, not fame, not a monument, just proof that you were here, that you mattered, even if it was only to the small, frightened people who paid you to end something they couldn't face themselves. Once, you were offered a badge, a sigil you could wear to prove you belonged to something bigger. A man with soft hands and a hard smile told you it would open doors, earn respect. You walked away before he finished the pitch. Because you learned early that belonging is just another way to be betrayed. And you've been betrayed enough times to know you don't need any more reasons to doubt the ground under your boots. Historians still debate whether the names carved into records were real, whether the ghosts they studied ever truly lived. You could have told them. They did. They just never stayed anywhere long enough to leave more than a smudge on the ledger. And when the ledgers were burned or lost, even the smudges vanished. You think about that sometimes as you pack your tools, as you check the lines of your knives, as you slip into another borrowed name. Maybe it's cowardice, but cowards live longer than martyrs. And you never wanted to be a martyr. You just wanted to survive. And in your line of work, That was the only victory that ever mattered. You're not sure how this ends. Some nights you tell yourself it doesn't, that you'll keep walking until your footprints fade into the dirt and the sky forgets to count your days. You imagine your story dissolving into the spaces between other people's stories, unremarked and unrecorded, just another shadow no one bothers to follow. But deep down, you know everything ends eventually. Even ghosts fade. Even whispers die. You wonder sometimes if you'll know when it's happening, or if it will feel like slipping into sleep. One blink too long, one breath too shallow, and then nothing at all. You try not to dwell on it. It isn't death you fear. You've stood close enough to it, felt its breath on your neck, watched it work. Clumsy, clean, quick, cruel. Death is another craftsman, a peer you've met too many times to despise. Number what you fear is being remembered wrong. You've already seen it start. There's a story now, told in the back alleys of a port city, about a knife spirit, a woman with glassy eyes and footsteps soft as rain. They say she only kills the wicked, that she leaves a coin on each eyelid as a mark of mercy. You did that once, just once, for a boy who reminded you of someone you used to be, small and shaking and too young to understand what he'd seen. The man who hurt him was drunk enough to snore through your entrance. The boy watched you set the coins in place, and for the first time in years, you thought you saw something like relief. Now, every time you hear that story repeated, the details change. The dagger gleams silver. The eyes glow. The coins multiply. You become myth. And you hate it. Because you didn't do it for glory. You did it because the boy was cold and crying. And the man who caused it had a laugh you couldn't bear to hear again. There's no honor in what you've done. But sometimes, there's a kind of justice. Even that is rare. Historians still argue whether you followed any code, any line you wouldn't cross, whether there was some hidden ledger of right and wrong etched into your habits. You know there was never a book, but there were rules. You never killed children. You never struck without reason. And you never stayed to hear gratitude. Because gratitude is the most dangerous thing of all. It makes you think you're necessary. It stains the clean edge of your act with hope. And hope is something you can't afford to carry. So whenever someone tried to thank you, you disappeared faster. Once, you spared a baker. A petty official tried to force him to bake a poisoned loaf. When he refused, they paid you to remove him. You accepted the job, but when the time came, you couldn't do it. You left him alive. You never returned to that town. But sometimes, when you pass another bakery, you think of flour on calloused hands and a man who looked surprised to see morning again. You tell yourself that was weakness, and maybe it was, but it's also the only thing you've done that still feels like it mattered. You used to imagine what it would be like to stop, to take off your knives and lay them on a table you owned, in a house that smelled of your own cooking, to look out a window without expecting to see anyone looking back. But you know yourself too well. Even in your dreams, you can't stay. Tonight, you're somewhere high in the hills. The road behind you is dusted with frost, the one ahead swallowed by fog. You have no job, no mark, no false name waiting to be worn. You are empty in a way you can't explain. Not lost, just between. You sit beside a smokeless fire, hands wrapped around your knees, and try to remember the last time you felt anything like peace. You can't. Not really. But the silence here isn't the same as the hush after a life ends. This silence feels honest. It doesn't accuse. It doesn't echo. It just is. You breathe slowly, testing the idea of staying still, of not planning the next town, the next disguise, the next exit. And for one moment, you allow yourself to think something you've never spoken aloud. You are tired of vanishing. You don't want a monument. You don't want songs. But maybe, just maybe, you want to be held in someone's memory. Not because you were feared, not because you were paid, but because you were real. Because you walked through the world and left something behind that wasn't only loss, even if it was just for a single person. You look up at the sky. The stars are pinpricks of pale fire, cold and indifferent. But for once, they don't feel like they're watching. They feel like they're waiting. You let your eyelids fall, and you tell yourself, just for tonight, that you might stay. No aliases, no contracts, no knives, just breath and warmth and the small, impossible wish that you could learn how to be more than the sum of everything you've done. Maybe tomorrow you'll move again, but tonight you'll rest. And in that stillness, you let yourself believe that if there's an end, it doesn't have to be the same as all the rest. It could be gentler. It could be yours. You don't have a ritual for endings. Other people do. Soldiers with their salutes, priests with their prayers, merchants with their ledgers balanced to the last coin. But you never learned how to close a chapter. You only ever learned how to move on before someone could shut the book for you. That's what makes tonight feel so strange. Because for the first time, you can remember. You don't feel like running. The fire is almost gone. The last coals pulsing low and red. The air smells of frost and old wood. You can taste the cold on your tongue each time you breathe. You think of all the places you've left behind, the villages where you changed your name like a coat, the inns where you studied every face, wondering which stranger would remember you too clearly, the crossroads where you chose the emptier path because the one with lanterns looked too much like belonging. You have left 1,000 footprints, and none of them ever stayed long enough to mean anything. Historians still debate whether men like you ever longed for home, whether you carried some scrap of sentiment folded in your pack, a token to remind you that you hadn't always been a weapon. You don't have an answer, because you can't remember if you ever had anything worth returning to. Once, you did carry something. A coin so worn its king's face had dissolved into a smooth oval. You kept it tucked behind the lining of your cloak, told yourself it was for luck. You lost it crossing a river, swept downstream before you could reach for it. You still think about that sometimes, the way you think about 100 little losses that never made it into any record. You never kept journals, never dared. Stories are dangerous. If you start writing them, you might believe them. If you believe them, you start thinking you deserve an ending worth telling. And in your trade, that's how you get killed. So you learn to let the stories slip away. No roots, no ties. But even so, you can't quite shake the feeling that some part of you was always searching for a reason to stop moving. You tried to stay once in a valley town where the air tasted like cedar and smoke. You thought you could vanish into the crowd, just another face in the market, just another set of hands carrying flour sacks from wagons to storerooms. But you couldn't do it, because each time you felt your shoulders begin to loosen, each time you heard someone call a name that almost sounded like yours, your heartbeat turned cold and hard, and you ran. You don't even remember which road you took. You've forgotten more places than you ever knew by heart. Mainstream tales pretend forgetting is freedom. They don't understand that forgetting is just another kind of burden, an emptiness that stretches out behind you, wider every year. Because when you can't remember where you came from, you can't be sure you're still the person who started the journey. If you were ever a person at all, tonight you sit watching the coals shrink to embers. You think about all the names you've borrowed, the ones you whispered like prayers and discarded like broken tools. You think about the faces of the people who paid you to be the answer to their problems. You think about the child you spared. You wonder if he ever told anyone what he saw, if he grew up believing he'd been saved, or if he learned the truth, that he'd simply met someone too tired to finish the work. You close your eyes and let the thought pass. You have learned to be careful with thoughts like that. They are the ones that make you hesitate. And hesitation is a luxury you've never afforded yourself. But tonight, the quiet doesn't feel dangerous. It feels like a space you've finally earned. No contracts, no voices in the dark offering silver you can't refuse. No need to wonder which lie you're living this week. Just you and the cold and the hush of a world that, for a moment, doesn't need anything from you. You tell yourself it won't last. It never does. But you allow yourself to imagine that it might. That if you sat here long enough, if you watched the last ember die, if you refused to pick up the blade you've carried for too many years, you might finally stop being the ghost in other people's stories. You might become something else. You don't know what. You only know you're ready to find out. And that's enough. You always thought you'd recognize the moment when your story was ending, that there would be some final sign, one last contract you couldn't refuse, one enemy who finally learned your true name, or a whisper so dangerous it could not be outrun. But now, sitting in the pale hush of dawn, you realize endings are quieter than you expected. They don't arrive like a blade in the dark. They creep in slowly, like fatigue that becomes so familiar you stop feeling it, like the way your hands no longer tense around the knife, because they remember the shape of surrender almost as well as the shape of steel. You look down at your hands now, pale and scarred and still. You flex your fingers once, just to be sure they still remember how to close around a weapon. They do, but they don't want to. You wonder if that counts as weakness. You think about all the places you've left behind, the cities where no one knew your name, the fields you crossed under moonlight, your breath steaming in the cold, the taverns where you listened to stories about yourself retold by men who never knew they were sitting beside the subject. Some of those stories were flattering. Most were not. But all of them were wrong, because no one ever talks about the ending. No one sings about what happens when the blade is set down and the last coin is spent, and you finally let yourself wonder what it might feel like to stop. Historians still argue whether killers like you ever laid down their trade willingly, whether you simply disappeared into the same darkness you came from. You suppose that's almost true. But you're not disappearing. You're just no longer running. There's a difference. You breathe in the cold morning air, tasting the promise of frost and something cleaner, something you don't have a name for. You remember the nobleman with the smooth hands who begged you for mercy. You remember sparing the baker whose only crime was refusing to bake a poison loaf. You remember the boy you didn't kill, who looked up at you with terror and something else, something like understanding. You never saw him again. You've tried to pretend none of it mattered, that you were nothing but a consequence, final answer to a question no one would say aloud. But tonight, for the first time, you let yourself admit that it mattered more than anything else, because it means you were never only a blade. You were a man, flawed man, a dangerous man, but still a man. You look toward the road you've never dared to take, the one that winds past the hills into the villages where no one knows your face. You wonder if you could walk it without glancing over your shoulder every third step. You imagine what it would be like to carry nothing but your own name. You imagine the taste of warm bread you bought with coin that didn't stink of guilt. You imagine falling asleep without planning how to vanish before dawn. It all sounds impossible, but so did surviving this long. You reach for the knife at your side. Your palm closes around the hilt with a familiarity that almost makes you smile. You remember the first time you held it, how heavy it felt, how sure, how final. Now it only feels tired, and you realize you are tired too. Tired in a way that sleep alone can't mend. Tired in your bones, in the space behind your ribs, in the soft, unguarded parts of you that you pretended you didn't have. For the first time, you don't try to push the feeling away. You set the knife down on the frost-slicked earth beside you. You don't expect it to stay there forever, but tonight, you don't need it. You close your eyes and breathe in the hush, and you feel something loosen inside you, something you've held so tightly it had become invisible. Maybe it's hope, or maybe it's just the memory of who you were before you learned to live by the edge of a blade. Either way, it's yours, and that is enough. You stand, your knees ache, your shoulders crack. You are no longer as fast as you once were, but you are here. And for the first time, you are not trying to leave. You look down the road, just a road, not an escape route. And you think that maybe, if you start walking, it will feel like something other than running away. It might even feel like becoming someone new, or simply becoming yourself again. You don't know. You don't need to. You take one step, then another. The cold dawn gathers around you, soft and indifferent, and you let it. The fire's glow has faded into a scatter of embers, small points of orange in a bed of ash. But you don't stir to rebuild it. For the first time in memory, you don't feel the impulse to fix, to prepare, to ready yourself for the moment when the quiet shatters. Because tonight, the quiet is the gift, and you are willing to receive it. The wind slips past the open doorway, cool but not cruel. It brushes your cheek, same way it did when you were a boy, when you still believed that nightfall was only something to sleep through, not something to survive. You let your eyes fall shut. There are no footsteps in the dark, no voices waiting to call your name, no faces you've tried so hard to forget. Just the hush, just the slow, measured rhythm of your own breathing. It is enough. Your body understands what your mind has always resisted. That stillness is not surrender. Stillness can be a kind of courage, too. You feel the ache in your spine, in your hands, in the places you've been wounded. For so long, you carried these pains as proof you were alive, proof you were necessary. Tonight, they are only reminders of a journey that cost you more than you ever expected to pay. And somehow, that makes them easier to bear. The stars above you are fading into dawn, pale and patient. They have watched you cross countless miles, shed countless names. They have never asked you for anything. And in their quiet company, you understand that you don't owe the world anything either. Not another name, not another apology, not another act of contrition. You have done enough. You have endured enough. And now you are allowed, just for these few moments, to rest without fearing the price. The wind carries the promise of another morning, of a road that stretches further than you can see. You don't know if you will follow it. You don't know if you will ever be ready to lay down every weapon, every lie, every defense. But you know this: you are not only what you have done. You are not only the silence you leave behind. You are still human, even in your weariness, even in your uncertainty. And that too is worth remembering. So you breathe, and as the last embers cool, you feel the smallest flicker of peace, real and warm, like something you might learn to keep. Maybe tomorrow you will rise and walk again. Maybe you will find a place where no one knows your face and no one cares who you used to be. Maybe you will never need to vanish again. But for now, you are here, and you are enough, just as you are, just for tonight, just this once. Sleep, and let the world turn without you. You have earned this rest.